Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our host an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
All right. Well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Bethany McLean. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Bethany before we get started. She's got quite a unique background. Bethany started as an investment banker at Goldman Sachs and was previously editor at large at Fortune magazine. And she is the author of the famous or perhaps infamous article, "Is Enron Overpriced?" Very, very excellent article that I would highly recommend people take a read. She is a special correspondent at Insider and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. She is the co-host of the podcast Capitalisn't. She is the co-author of Smartest Guys in the Room, All the Devils Are Here, and The Big Fail. I've read each one of those books, and I would highly recommend that people take a read of them. Each of them are terrific. And she's also the author of the books Shaky Ground, The Strange Saga of the U.S. Mortgage Giants, and Saudi America, The Truth About Fracking and How It Is Changing the World. She's got a very unique background. So when I had first reached out to Bethany to talk about, or for jumping on the podcast, the original game plan was to talk about her most recent book, The Big Fail, which is a story about how the U.S. reacted and dealt with the COVID pandemic. And then what I did is I also picked up the Enron book, and I figured, you know what, maybe I would just kind of flip through a couple of pages and do a quick summary of Enron. But then I read the first page and I just couldn't stop from there, Bethany. I basically went through the entire book. And I would, even though the book is, whatever it is, 15 or 20 years old, it is just as relevant today as it was when it was written, again, 15 or 20 years ago. And as I've told many people in my space, it is a must read. Like if you have an interest in business, if you have an interest in accounting, whatever it may be, it is frankly a must read business book. I had a couple people tell me, well, can we just watch the TV show or the doc that was done on it? I said, no, you have to read the book because the book goes into all the nitty gritty details of, kind of the back and forth and what happened to Enron, kind of behind the scenes. So it's not good enough to just watch the doc. You have to actually read the book because the book is fantastic. And then I started learning about, Bethany, the other book you co-wrote, which was All the Devils Are Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis. So on a family road trip to back and forth to New York, I picked up the audiobook and I listened to that book. And again, that is another terrific read of what happened in 2008 and the history of the financial crisis and some of the major real estate players that were involved. And again, I would highly recommend that people take a read of that book. As with many things in the financial cycle, history tends to repeat itself. And again, there's a lot of really good learnings because something like what you describe in your book in 2008, it will happen again at some point. It's just a matter of time. And the better prepared you are when that happens, probably the better off you'll be. And again, I would highly recommend people take a read of that book. So when we first started, I thought we were just going to talk about COVID and maybe a couple questions on Enron. But then after now, Bethany, I've read all three of these books. Now we're going to try and cover them, at least touch on them all here in our chat. And because again, they're all terrific reads. So thank you very much for joining. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
So first thing I want to do is start with Enron. Because I want to go back in time to 2001, and especially maybe for the younger folks who are listening to this, you might think of Enron as a ghost, and an entity that you probably don't know very well, or maybe all you know is bad things about it. But if we go back into into March of 2001, Enron at this point was one of the most valuable companies in the world, one of the most prominent companies in the world, who was run by, again, a lot of very prominent individuals. Bethany then wrote an article at Fortune entitled, "Is Enron Overpriced?" And again, I've heard you say before, Bethany, perhaps that is the most understated title in history, and that might be right. But again, you got to remember when that article was written, it was written when Enron was still up at the top. It was not after everything, after the big fallout. And I just wanted to read some actual quotes from the article because, again, I would highly recommend people actually go back and take a read of that article, because it's very interesting, especially when you read it with 2020 hindsight. But I just wanted to read a couple of actual quotes from investment bankers who were following Enron during this time. So these are actual quotes from the article. Number one, Enron has built unique and, in our view, extraordinary franchises in several business units in very large markets. That was one of the quotes. When asked how Enron makes money, again, this is an actual quote from the article itself. The answer is, if you figure it out, let me know. This is from the investment bankers that are actually following Enron. And again, another question when it's talking about, what Enron does or how it generates earnings or cash flow, the answer is Enron is a big black box. And these are all actual articles from people who are trying to defend the state of Enron or the multiples that it's trading at. Shortly after the article is written, not long after at all, Enron effectively collapses. Enron enters bankruptcy protection. Arthur Andersen, again, if you're of a certain vintage like myself, I would remember Arthur Andersen as one of the largest accounting firms in the world at that time. There was a time when we used to refer to the Big Eight and the Big Six. Now it's down to the Big Four. But there was a time when Arthur Andersen was listed amongst the largest accounting firms in the world. And not long after that article, Arthur Andersen effectively disappeared and was, it was erased because of the Enron situation. Several executives at Enron were subsequently charged with fraud and ultimately served lengthy jail sentences. And there were several regulatory changes, including the introduction of Sarbanes-Oxley, which is, again, as relevant today as it was back in the early 2000s when it first came into place. And it's fascinating to me, Bethany, all of that happened. Your article to some degree was the catalyst that kind of, got people focusing on this issue. And I'm fascinated to know, obviously, when you look at it in hindsight, that article, you look at it in a certain way and everything would seem to make sense. But if you go back in time, again, putting yourself, if I were to put myself in your shoes at that time, again, you're writing an article about a company that is very, very successful at the, almost at the height of its powers. And just maybe take us back to then, like, what were you thinking at the time? And did you ever think that the fallout from that article, that you were as right as you were in that article? Like, maybe just take us back to that time and how do you reflect upon it now?
Sure. So, no, I had no idea. I think the headline would have been a lot tougher had I had any idea of the extent of the problems at Enron, because given that it was bankrupt 6 months after I wrote that, yes, it was clearly overpriced. When I set out to write the article, it was really because the company's stock price didn't make sense based on what its business was and how little people understood of how it made money. The idea that it was as hollow at its core as it was, or that the problems were deep enough to bankrupt the company, I would have been astonished if you had told me that at the time. I really just approached it from this analytical framework of, everybody thinks this company is so fantastic and the stock trades at this really high multiple, and all the analysts who cover it, as you mentioned from some of the quotes, are telling investors to buy the stock, and they have price targets on the stock that are 50% higher than where the stock is trading now. And yet nobody understands how this company makes money. And so that was the impetus for the story. I've always been, throughout my career, fascinated by things that just don't add up when there's some sort of mystery at the heart of something, or when things don't quite add up. And so that was really it. And I think if I had known that Enron's reaction to my questions would be as intense as it was, I might have been afraid to have started the article. But I really thought that they would sort of dismiss me and just say, oh, yeah, these are legitimate questions about our business, but here's why they don't really make sense. And here's why you're wrong. And that would be the end of it. And so when their pushback was as intense as it was, they got a couple of people to fly up to New York to sit down with me, et cetera, et cetera. Jeff Skilling, who was then the CEO, lost his temper on the phone and told me I was unethical for writing a piece like this. And you can hear my dogs howling in the background. I'm sorry. There's only so much I can do to keep it
They're
quiet.
supporters, Bethany. They're saying,
Exactly.
hey, she was exactly right. The dogs agree with you.
My dogs are chiming in.
Exactly.
But that is, I guess I've thought about that later in life as the years have gone by, about a good lesson in the value of just getting started, because you don't know where things are going to take you. And once you get started, it's very hard to, if when you're thinking about the whole thing, you know how intense it's going to get and how angry people are going to be, you might never start. But if you don't know and you just get started, then once you're in it, you just have to deal with where you are. And so I think the whole thing is a testament to the value of just getting started.
And would it be fair to say that a good warning sign that there's an issue is the reaction on the other side? That the higher the reaction, the more defensive they get, the higher the likelihood that there is an issue. Is that a fair relationship?
I think that is over. I think I would say that over my career, that's true. I didn't really understand that at the time. And so the fact that their reaction was this intense, I was just intimidated, frankly. I think looking back, it was that intense because they were worried. And I think in general, that's true. It's not always true, but in general, people get much more angry when you're onto something and when there's something to hide.
You tell a great story as well about your interactions with Andy Fastow during that time. Maybe just give some perspective on that story, on that interaction with Andy. Jeff, I guess, dialed in on the phone, but Andy, I think, came up to meet you in person. Maybe
Yeah.
just talk a little bit about that, because some of his comments were quite surprising, to say the least.
Well, he did at the end of this. I think it was a 2 or 3 hour conversation in this windowless dark conference room at Fortune. And at the end of that, he said, "Well, I don't care what you say about the company. Just don't make me look bad." And he was laughing. It was a joke. But I've thought a lot since then about humor and what it reveals. And often there's a lot that encompasses humor, right? It can be anger, it can be fear, it can be a surprising element of truth running through a joke. And so in this case, it was a joke, but it was true as well. It would come out in the bankruptcy that Andy basically was putting his own interests in front of the company. And so that comment was very telling about his relationship to Enron.
And when you look at it and boil it down, and I would ask you, why did Enron fail? Again, you have a lot of people who are listening to this who are accountants, and
Yeah.
and this is why, as an accountant, your book is a must read, because it really shows you the pressure that the accountants can face and how things play out. My 2 cents on it is that the business didn't fail because of the accounting per se. The accounting tried to hide and cover up a lot of the problems that were there. That's just my two cents on the issue. But if I were to ask you, why did Enron fail? What would be the answer to that? If you were to simplify it down, what do you think the answer to that question is?
I think Enron failed because people were surprised. And let me offer a little bit of context around that. Your view that the accounting was covering up the problems is exactly right. That's what was happening. There was a great deal of pressure on the accountants to make transactions look a certain way. And so the fascinating thing when you step back from Enron is that it was very difficult to prosecute, because not a lot of what they did was actually illegal. What they did was push and twist and use the rules to create a picture of their economics that was actually not at all in line with reality, that was covering up a lot of the problems in the business. And so when investors found out that this is what Enron was doing and that there was a lot that they didn't know, there was this announcement in the fall of 2020 that they had to restate their earnings because of some of the accounting shenanigans, and people were shocked. And Enron's business was a trading business, which relied on constant access to the capital markets. And so the capital markets shut down and Enron couldn't raise the money it needed to finance itself. And so when Jeff Skilling has said that Enron failed because of a run on the bank, and in a sense that's true, but often when there's a run on a bank, it's because people panic, and people panic because suddenly they realize that what they were looking at is not what it is. And so there was a reason for the run on the bank, and that's why in the end Enron had failed. It wasn't inevitable. If Enron had owned up all along to the problems in its business and portrayed them honestly, its stock price never would have been as high. And Skilling would not have been regarded as this genius CEO, but the company probably wouldn't have failed if Enron had admitted that it had problems and raised more equity and used its high stock price to raise more equity. Again, the business might not have failed, but the powers that be at Enron didn't want to raise equity because they were afraid that would signal weakness to the market and would make it look like Enron needed cash. So there was nothing inevitable about Enron's failure, and there was actually a lot of reality to its businesses. It's not a gigantic fraud in the way that most people can think it is. How's that for a much longer answer than you
No,
you
no,
did?
it's a great answer, Bethany.
But
I totally like it's not. It's the reality is these are not simple questions. You know,
right.
I think what you're saying, I totally agree. Because the other thing the other thing I wanted to touch on is kind of exactly what you had said. This is not a situation where someone went in and stole $5 million or $10 million from the company. You do when you read the book, you can actually sympathize with some of these folks like Jeff Skilling,
Yeah.
Andy Fastow to some degree because again they're not like again it's not like I'm not trying to simplify this, but it's not like they just completely stole money from the company. In some cases, again, Jeff actually wanted to come back and help the company almost because he believed in the future of the company. And he believed that if they could just get over these short-term issues, that Enron would fix itself. And that's why if you sat with them now, I don't know if you have any relationship with the executives now, but what do you think they would, after 20 years of thinking about this or 20 plus years, and you were to ask them, why did it fail? Do you think the answer would be because there was a run on the banks and maybe we had too much debt? Or do you think it's a more complicated answer than that?
So Andy Fastow has been out on the speaking tour for a while, and he says a lot of things that are really worth listening to about how accounting can misrepresent economic reality. I think he would say Enron failed because they didn't want to own up to the problems and raise more equity, and I think that would be his answer. I think he downplays his own role in it because he was effectively stealing money from Enron through these outside partnerships that he ran. And when the company had to restate its earnings and when Enron had to fire him, that sent shockwaves through the market. And that was part of the element of surprise that I was talking about. Investors don't ever want to be surprised. I mean, they want to be surprised in a good way. They want earnings to be better than expected. They want some great new product, but they don't want to be surprised by suddenly finding out that the business they thought they were looking at is not what they thought. That's unless you've got a huge pot of cash ready to absorb the shock of that. If you're a business that needs access to the markets and you do that to your investor base, you might go bankrupt. That's the way it works. I think Jeff Skilling would still say it's a run on the bank, and I in retrospect am. I think I had some degree of sympathy for him at the time because this is not a evil man who set out to destroy a company. That's not the right way to think about this. And I think I am, as the years go by and I get older too, I am more sympathetic because, all of these stories of business gone wrong are stories of human nature in the end. And if some of us are not confronted with our worst traits or worst possibilities, then you just got lucky. It's not as if they're not there. So one of the lessons I never want people to come away with from all of this is sort of a holier than thou. Look at those bad people out there and the bad things they did, because I think we all have the capacity to not be great within us.
And the other thing too is we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you're going to make decisions. Maybe they took on too much debt. Maybe they didn't, chose not to raise enough equity. Bad decisions, obviously, again, there's obviously a line between what's legal and illegal. But people make bad decisions and companies go bankrupt.
Yeah.
That certainly can happen.
Yeah. I guess a different way of saying what I was trying to say is that if your bad decisions and your mistakes stay small and confined, then you've gotten lucky. But I think some people get unlucky and their bad decisions and their human frailties and their vanity and their weakness results in this fantastic conflagration, but it's not necessarily because they were worse than any of the rest of us. Their failings just happened to intersect with something mammoth and result in something like Enron.
Agreed. The other thing I wanted to ask you about as well is corporate culture, because, again, you might look at it and say, "Well, we would never do that." Well, maybe if you were in the Enron culture, maybe what would happen is somebody who had certain views going in, and after enough years at working in a culture where it kind of pushed certain things, is that somebody might change. You know what I mean? And it might not necessarily be all their fault. It might just be
Wow.
the fault of the corporate culture. Maybe just talk a little bit about, the culture within Enron, and do you agree with that or not? Do you think the corporate, with all of us in the culture that we, that we try and encourage at all the different companies we would all work at, how important that is to making sure that, people stay on the right side?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important, and even with the recognition that it's important, that still understates how important it is. I remember, this is going to sound like a bit of a tangent, but I remember being at the Grand Canyon with my kids a bunch of years ago, and the tour guide said that the Grand Canyon is getting deeper by the width of a piece of paper, by the depth of a piece of paper every year. And I thought, oh, even the Grand Canyon is still making itself all the time. And so we are still making ourselves all the time too. And if you put yourself into a culture where bad things are encouraged, or you're going to become that. You are
Yeah.
you are going to inevitably change to be in line with that. And I've thought about that a lot. That when I was leaving Goldman Sachs, as you mentioned, if I had, instead of going into journalism, if a recruiter had said, "Hey, there's this great company down in Texas doing all these interesting things," if
Hmm.
I had gone to Enron, would I have been on the side of the angels, or would I have been someone who was complicit in what went wrong there? And of course, I want to believe the former, but I think the answer is probably the latter. And so I think what that speaks to is the importance of choosing a culture that looking around at the environment and the people you see, and making sure you want to be like those people. And if you don't want to be like those people, and then don't choose that, because it will inevitably shape you and shape everybody who comes in contact with it. And the culture of Enron was one where people were valued for the earnings they could produce, and it was a very money-oriented way of looking at the world. You were your bottom line, and you weren't necessarily the bottom line of reality. You were the bottom line of how you could make a transaction look on the income statement, and that inevitably shaped the way that how people were.
And if you're to look at red flags, so even if you take the learnings from Enron and you apply it to the reality today, do you think it's as simple as, the importance of cash flow? And that when you're looking at and trying to build relationships, let's say between cash flow and revenue slash profitability, that if you're struggling to find a relationship there where one's going one way and another's going the other way, south, one's going north and one's going south, that it's probably an indicator that there's a big problem. Because again, one of the very interesting things in your Enron book is that was the one issue that Enron always struggled with,
Yeah.
is trying to hit, they could deal with earnings, and hit their earnings targets after some maneuvering, but the cash flow, which was a lot harder to maneuver and get there. And if we take those learnings and apply it today, is it as simple as that? Like, is that kind of red flag number one, or is there others, or is there maybe other things that would trump that?
I think that is a big red flag. Cash is a lot harder to fake than earnings. That's the old rule. It can be faked. I think in the case of Wirecard, I never studied that, but I think Wirecard managed to fake cash, and there have been frauds where companies have managed to fake the cash. But cash is a lot harder than earnings, and so if earnings are going in one direction and cash is showing an entirely, and the cash flow from operations is showing an entirely different picture, it's not necessarily the sign of fraud, but you really better understand why and what's going on there. And I think I had the great luck when I worked in investment banking. I was just a junior analyst, but I worked with a more senior guy, and we would sit in these due diligence meetings, and he would they would be endless. And he would go through with the company CFO how the income statement related to the balance sheet, related to the cash flow statement. And if you're an analyst looking at a company, you should be able to understand that. You should understand how those three statements relate to each other and be able to tie them together. And if you can't, that's a problem. The related party transactions are another thing. They're less blatant than they were because I think people know now that people will look at those. But, in the case of Enron, nobody who followed the company at the time looked at the related party statements to see that it was disclosed that a senior officer of Enron was running these off-balance sheet partnerships that did all their business with Enron. And anyone who is an analyst following the company should have looked at that and said, "Wait, what is that? How does that work?" And so maybe that's another lesson, because I think even today, financial statements and disclosures are big, huge documents, and I think a lot of people who are supposed to read them don't read them. So I guess another big picture lesson I would get at from this is never assume that other people have done their homework. And that's just the case throughout business history, whether it's Enron, whether it's the banks leading up to the financial crisis, whether it's Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, whether it's this big drug company called Valiant. People would look at it and say, "Oh, look at the smart people who believe in this and who are saying this is great. Why should I bother to do my homework? I can just piggyback off their work. Of course it's great." And throughout history, you see that people have gotten it wrong, sometimes for reasons of corruption, but sometimes coming back to what we were talking about because people just get it wrong.
Agreed. And that's a great way to lead in, frankly, to your next book is don't assume that other people are doing your homework for you.
Right.
And
Well
that,
said.
all these regulatory changes, or, a significant regulatory change that came out of Enron was Sarbanes-Oxley, which again continues to be as relevant today as it was, 25 years ago or 20 years ago when it first came into play. So they put it in place and they say, kind of, look, like this isn't gonna happen again. And then that leads us to your next book, All the Devils Are Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis and what happened in 2008. And the book doesn't just talk about what happened, but it talks a lot about the lead up. And there's a lot of common themes and things like that you can take from Enron and you can apply to this book as well. Because again, as we learn, history does tend to repeat itself. And I think maybe the history is repeating itself in a slightly different way. With the financial crisis, different types of companies, but again, it does repeat itself. So maybe just 10,000 foot, you finish off your Enron book, and then you'd say to yourself, okay, I want to write a book now on the financial crisis. So Bethany, why'd you pick the 2008 financial crisis as your next sort of book of choice after Enron?
Well, I'll give you a long answer once again. So I remember in the wake of Enron thinking, I'm 30, 31, 32, whatever it was. And I guess my career is all downhill again from here because I've seen I've seen the big scandal has happened, and this isn't going to happen again in my lifetime. I mean, that's it. This is over. It was so naive. We actually, my co-author and I, when Jeff Skilling and Ken Lay were convicted in the summer of 2006, the spring of 2006. And my co-author and I wrote a piece for Fortune about how the business community was on alert now that behavior in the gray would no longer be tolerated, and that we were demanding a higher standard from business executives. And of course, in the summer of 2006, the financial crisis was already well underway. The seeds of it had already been planted, and terrible mortgages were being made to people who couldn't pay them back. I mean, that had already all reached its apex. And Wall Street firms were buying these terrible mortgages without looking at them and packaging them into securities that they were selling on to investors. And it was all already happening, and nobody cared at all about it. And so anyway, with that as a preamble, my longtime collaborator, Joe Nocera, who was my editor at Fortune and who edited Smartest Guys, he was actually visiting me in Chicago on the day that Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. And we both said, there's just a loud crash upstairs. I think scary. Okay, well, we're not going to worry about that right now. Once again, my household seems to be underscoring my remarks in very interesting
They seem to be agreeing. They're either agreeing or they're disagreeing. Bethany, what are the two options?
I don't know. I have 3 large dogs, and so it's constant chaos around here. Anyway, and so we said, oh, well, we have to write a book about this. And so I think somewhat inadvertently, I've become a chronicler of business disasters. I certainly didn't set out to do that, but when there's a big business disaster, there I am at the scene of the crash. It's like I'm the classic ambulance chaser. That's
there's a lot of good lessons. Like you know, when you wrote the book and you reflect back, like, do you think we all learned our lesson from, from Enron? Like, why does history tend to repeat itself?
I don't.
We
Yeah.
all read your book and then boom, all of a sudden, or we all learn what happens with Enron and then history repeats itself, 7 or 8 years later. Do you think that is just how it is? Or like, what do you think? What do you think is the cause for that?
Well, maybe everyone didn't read my book, so now everybody should go out and read it. No, I'm kidding. That's not.
They should. I agree with that.
But no, I think that self-delusion and rationalization are such huge parts of the human psyche that I don't think anybody realizes that the lessons of a particular story might apply to them. In other words, I think if any executive or any person who's in the process going down a path that might lead to a bankruptcy, a conflagration, and they're going to be in the crosshairs of the Justice Department that say, "Oh, no, 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 I'm not doing that." But nobody sees that that's where something is headed at the time when they embark on it. They think, "Oh, I'm doing the right thing for my investors because I'm just getting through this period right now, pretending everything is okay, and then it's going to be okay." Um, I think to be a business leader, you have to have a lot of hope and optimism that it's all going to work out. If you're constantly afraid that it's all going to fail, then you probably are not going to be a leader. And that optimism can cross the line into fraud without necessarily the intent being there to deceive people. Or you can rationalize it and believe that you're deceiving people in their best interests. Because if you told them what was really going on, the stock price would crash or people would lose their money. And hey, if you just hang on a little bit longer, you're gonna make it all work. And I think often, look, we're not that smart. People don't look up and see that they're building something that could trigger the collapse of the global financial system. I think isolated investment bankers who were selling these terrible securities onto clients understood that the securities were terrible. I don't think they understood that that could lead to the collapse of the global financial system. I mean, very rarely are we able to are we able to see, even when we have a hand on the pieces that are going to lead to the collapse. Very rarely are we able to put them together and say, this is what's going to happen.
Because one difference between your Enron book and the next book, All the Devils Are Here, is that Enron focused on one company. The Enron book focused on one company. In the next book, we're talking about several entities, and a lot of like really, really smart people were involved. Like, you're talking about these complex derivative securities that are being bundled together. Lots of different entities. Your book goes into a lot of the history, let's say on Fannie and Freddie and how they kind of evolved over time. But it's completely different in that there are a lot of people involved. And again, you've got US government officials as well in terms of, thoughts on interest rates and things like that. You've got this whole group, which is completely different than the first book. And when you look in, when you look back now, let's call it in hindsight, do you think that all of the players should have been able to predict that 2008 financial crisis? Or do you think that it is one of these things, this blue moon, this black swan scenario where no one ever thought housing prices would decline? It's never happened. I think in your book, it said you almost have to go back to the Great Depression in the
Yeah.
US when the housing prices really declined. Who really could have predicted something like that, like this black swan event? So where are you on that? Do you think that the players involved should have been able to predict it? Or is it a black swan event that happens once every 100 years and no one would be able to predict it?
I don't necessarily think that the players involved should have been able to predict it, but I do think the players involved should have seen that something was going badly wrong. So, in other words, if you're making mortgages to people who can't pay them back, then you understand that there's something deeply wrong, that the system is permitting this. If you are an investment bank and you're buying packages of those securities in order to bundle them up and sell them on to your clients, and you understand that those securities aren't passing your own due diligence test because they're being made to people who can't pay them back, in the end, in the end, if a great number of mortgages are being made to people who can't pay them back, then the risk is going somewhere, right?
Yep.
And so I think
Yep.
people should have understood that the risk was going somewhere. Should people have been able to trace it all the way through the complex derivatives that were being created and the way that may lead to a meltdown of the entire financial system? Again, not necessarily, because it's not a one-to-one. In other words, the losses that were caused by these securities, the dollar volume of those losses should not have been enough to crater the financial system. What it was, again, as with Enron, was surprise. People didn't understand that this was what was happening. People didn't understand where this risk was going. And when it started to come out that so many players had been complicit in making mortgages to people who couldn't pay them back, and that these things were basically littered like ticking time bombs throughout the financial system, people freaked out and panicked, and that led to basically the almost collapse of the whole system. So once again, the lesson is surprise. That's what did it. Lots of people have tried to trace to do it as an analytical exercise to say, here's why this problem in subprime mortgages led to this giant conflagration. But the numbers don't tie together in a way that analytically makes sense. The element that's missing is this element of surprise, of people losing confidence in the system, people losing confidence that the players in the system are telling them what they needed to know. And in this case, a big part of it was the credit rating agencies, which told investors until a couple of days before Enron's bankruptcy that its debt was investment grade. And in this case, told investors that these securities that were being packaged up deserved a AAA rating, that they were super safe. And when everybody started to figure out that wasn't true, and that there was all sorts of corruption going on in the packaging of these securities, everyone freaked out.
Now, the other thing too is that a lot of the players that were involved, you mentioned the credit rating agencies, they're still around today. A lot of them that you mentioned in the book, and probably a lot larger and more powerful than what they were back in 2008. And the other
Yeah.
thing is, after I read these two books back to back, Bethany, you start to get a certain negative view on the stock market today. So again, I don't know if it's just because I read it back to back, but it certainly got me thinking, in a much different way about the market. And it got me thinking as well, like, where does Bethany actually invest her money? Like, does she actually trust trust the stock market? And you're a sophisticated investor. And I just wanted to get your perspective. My perspective is look, like, the stock market is a dangerous area in that you have to know what you're doing. Because the other thing from your two books is that these are not issues that can be described in one or two sentences. These are both another similarity, I'd say, between your Enron book and the book on the '08 financial crisis. These are complex transactions that are being, in the case of Enron, got these partnerships. In the case of the '08 book, of these complex derivative securities, the layperson to try and understand those, even someone like myself who has a background in finance, still is very difficult, frankly, to get your head wrapped around it.
Yeah.
What would be your advice for somebody on, I want to put my savings in the stock market, or I want to save money. What's the
Yeah.
right path for them?
Well, I am not. In my early years at Fortune, I did do some personal finance, and I just want to preface what I say by saying I'm not a personal finance advisor in any way, shape, or form. And I actually, weirdly enough, have never been interested in investing my own money to a fault. When I discover something interesting happening in the market, I want to write about it. I want to explain it, but I don't want to use it as a way to make money or save myself money. I have no interest in investing. It's a weird. You would think that I would be able to take all this knowledge I have and translate it into investing, and I don't. So I don't. So this is, I'm going to talk at a more philosophical level than a pragmatic level, because if I were to tell people how to invest their money, you probably shouldn't pay attention to me, because I don't know. But I do think that you have to invest with the awareness that there's a lot that you don't know, and that the picture you're seeing may be the picture that people want you to see, and that the reality under the surface can be wildly different than what's being portrayed to you. I actually hate this way of thinking that was becoming prevalent, or this marketing line that was becoming prevalent in the late 1990s, which is that you as an individual investor can compete with the big players and you can know as much as they can. No, you can't.
Absolutely.
It doesn't mean you can't beat them sometimes, because they get it wrong too, as we've been talking about. But they are going to have more access to information than you do. There is no such thing as a level playing field. That's not the way this works. And so I think that you have to invest with that awareness. That said, if you had followed my lead and become skeptical and cynical about the market and not put your money in it, you would have missed out on one of the great opportunities to make money in the past decades. And I think that actually does lead into a part of the big fail and something that is important, which is the role of the Federal Reserve. And that as long as the Federal Reserve is underpinning the stock market, since basically the collapse of the market in 1987, Black Monday, but then long-term capital management in the late 1990s, the Fed has stepped in whenever there's a problem and rescued the market. And as long as people believe that the Fed is going to do that, the market is going to keep going up, and it's going to be leveraged to what the Federal Reserve does, less so to what any individual company does, and more so to what the Fed does. But that also is a great big unknown, right? Because is the Fed going to keep bailing out the stock market? Is it going to be able to keep bailing out the stock market, even if that's what it wants to do? So those, I think, are the bigger questions, and I think they are beyond the grasp of anyone to know or figure out.
Would you put your trust as an investor in the regulatory bodies, whether it be the SEC or whomever, whomever it is? One of the
No.
big things from Enron that gets talked a lot about in the book is the use of the mark-to-market accounting, and the fact that that was signed off by the regulatory bodies, and not to say that the mark-to-market accounting was wrong, because it wasn't. It was
Yeah.
permitted under generally accepted accounting principles. However, you can certainly manipulate mark-to-market accounting a lot easier than you could if you weren't using it.
Well,
And I'm just wondering, and again, the regulatory bodies, even in the '08 financial crisis as well. I'm just wondering, from after everything you've learned, do you think, as an investor, you could sit back and say, well, if the regulatory bodies, if these companies are listed on these exchanges, then they must be good. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and I'm going to quibble with one thing that you said. I don't think mark-to-market accounting is any better, any worse than any other system of accounting. Accounting is a language, and it's not an absolute truth, and it can be used to try to get closer to the truth of what a business looks like, or it can be used to misrepresent the truth of what a business looks like. But accounting is in the hands of the user, just like a language is in the hands of the user. And I don't think there's any method of accounting that is not susceptible to abuse of some sort. But more broadly, to your question about the regulators, no, over time, and it's not because the regulators are ill-intended, but over time they've been one step behind, and regulations have been looking backwards to what went wrong last time and not looking forward to what's going to go wrong this time. So, for instance, after the financial crisis, we were pretty monomaniacally focused on the big banks, tightening capital standards and making sure that the big banks were bulletproof and safe. And guess what? In the pandemic, the big banks, when the market collapsed in the early stages of the pandemic, the big banks would have been the last to go. They were safe. But this whole fear that we called as the shadow banking system, which was also a huge part of what went wrong in the financial crisis, has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. So while regulators have been staring, and we've all been focused on bank capital standards, this whole other area of risk has been blossoming and growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And for instance, money market funds almost cratered in the in the pandemic again, and they were one of the culprits in the financial crisis as well. And the industry successfully pushed back against some of the reforms of money market funds, and others turned out to backfire and to make money market funds actually more prone to a run than they had been in the financial crisis. And that's part of what led to the near collapse of the financial system in the pandemic. So regulators are both looking backwards and no more capable than the rest of us are of seeing the whole picture and seeing what could happen when a match is lit.
And when you look on the company side of things, do you think that we're always going to be, that history is just prone to repeat itself, that you're going to still have this handful of companies where, short-term profitability is going to outweigh, let's say, long-term goals of the company, and that, it's just a matter of time before we have another Enron? Do you think it's just, that history will just keep on repeating itself? We have, Sarbanes-Oxley, we've got all these other, controls in place, but ultimately, human behavior can, to some extent, override some of these other, controls that are in place, and that there will be another Enron. It's just a matter of when it's going to happen, not necessarily if it's going to happen.
Well, there have been other Enrons. I mean, Theranos was another Enron. Wirecard was another Enron. In some ways, Valiant, even though the big pharmaceutical company, even though it didn't go bankrupt, that was another Enron. So it does keep happening over and over again. And yes, I think it always will, because there are limitations of rules and regulations to shape human behavior. And because of this aspect of us all that we touched on earlier, which is people's tendency to rationalize and deceive ourselves. And so nobody ever believes that it's going to happen to them, and this is where they're going to end up. But on a more positive note, also because the capacity for hope is endless, and you want investors to believe in that thing that seems too good to be true, that next great idea that might revolutionize the world. You want people to be willing to put
Yep.
capital behind that and believe in that. That's part of what makes our country special, and what allows for innovation is that people are willing to believe. And if we all became a nation of doubters and cynics and said, "Oh, that new idea is never going to work. Look at all the potential. Look at all the things that could go wrong with that," then it really would be over. And so, to some extent, you want hope to continue, even if that hope sometimes becomes gullibility, and we all get suckered.
Well, and the other thing too, I think is helpful to remember is that, there's the quote of, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in three generations, where, and then it's more referring to an individual and how that individual, the son kind of let's say starts the business, the father, builds it up into something great. And then when then when the grandkids, or sorry, when the grandfather starts it, the father then builds it into something great. And then the father's kids kind of run it into the ground. It's just kind of the natural cycle of wealth to some degree, because there's been lots of examples of that. If you go back in time and look at, again, the number of companies that are still around today that started, 25 or 50 years ago, the landscape has changed considerably, because again, to some degree, the life cycle of many companies is the same sort of thing, is that they start, they grow, and at some point the competition just overtakes them for a variety of reasons. Do you think that's part of it as well? That it's just the evolution of companies that at some point, the vast majority of them will just go away, because again, that is just kind of the history of corporations in North America or in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a separate issue. I think that's definitely part of the story of the business landscape, and that's a healthy aspect of it. You want there to be that kind of regeneration. If the biggest companies in America were the same companies that were the biggest companies in America in 2000, and the same companies that were the biggest companies in America in 1950, then something would have gone terribly wrong. So you want that healthy process of regeneration. I think that's a different story and a different narrative than the story of these occasional conflagrations, where something is not what it was cracked up to be, and where something is too good to be true, and all of our belief in this thing that was too good to be true, or which in retrospect is clearly going to seem to be too good to be true, comes crashing down on all of us. And so that's a separate narrative arc, but I think they're both part of the broad story of business.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's well put. I totally agree with you. So now we have the next big disruption. It's not necessarily a financial, or at least at its heart, it's not a financial matter. But COVID-19 is effectively what your next book what talks about. And I got to ask you. So again, you spent most of your time, or a lot of your career is very financial. A lot of financial aspects of your background, obviously. And then you decided to go and write on a different topic. Now, again, the common theme amongst all three of these is, you mentioned surprise. I think that's a great theme between each one of these. Shock to the system and disruption, and it obviously impacts a lot of people. But why did you want to write a book on COVID-19 and kind of looking back at that particular issue?
So I'll get to that, but I do want to touch on what you just said about surprise, because sometimes when I give talks, I tell people that the lesson you should keep in mind is what you were told in kindergarten: use your imagination, anything can happen. Because I think if you look just over the history of my career, it's been constantly anything can happen. This gigantic company that everybody thinks is the next big thing turns out to be effectively a fraud. The global financial system blows up. A pandemic comes along that shuts down our country and shuts down the world for a period of time. Nobody, in retrospect, if you had, leading up to each of these events, if you had said to someone, "This is what's going to happen," they would have said, "No, no, 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 that can't possibly happen. That's something out of, out of science fiction." And it did. So again, that element of surprise, and then the problem with surprise, of course, is that it always is surprise. You can never be prepared for it, but you can at least be aware that you might be surprised. Anyway, so to get back to your question, I think when Joe and again, I worked with Joe on this book. When we set out to do it, we did envision it as more of a business story than what we wrote turned out to be, even though it is it is a business story, and an economic story, but it's more than that. But we all forget that in the spring of 2020, the market almost collapsed, and so we set out to write about what that looked like and what that meant for what the world would look like going forward. And then this book, more than any other one that I had worked on, ended up morphing, and becoming perhaps too much of a jangle of competing themes. I have a very hard time going back and rereading my own work, so you'll have to tell me if it all came together in something coherent or not. But I think Joe and me in particular, when the pandemic hit, I was very distraught about the way in which we handled it with lockdowns, and so that the fact that we lurched into lockdowns, as a way of handling the pandemic, also became part of the theme of our book, as did the mess that our healthcare system is. And so the book ended up being about a lot of different things.
No, I thought the book was terrific. I
Thank
think I think what it does is it takes some very specific issues that might be different in terms of, like, there might not be a clear relationship necessarily between some of them, but it takes them and it talks about them in depth, right? Because you're almost going back and doing a debrief on COVID,
Yeah.
and it's so fresh in all of our minds still, that we can all relate to all the things that you touch on, that you touch on in the book. And I got to ask you as well, the concept of co-authoring, like, in terms of deciding whether to author a book or co-author a book. The other thing too is, again, you've co-authored, a couple of your books, obviously with Joe. What's the kind of the process to figure out if I want to write it myself, or if I want to, because I can imagine those are quite different, are quite different projects, whether you're going to go solo or whether you're going to co-author it with somebody else.
Yeah, so for me, the common theme is Joe. He was my editor at Fortune, and I co-authored the Enron book with a guy named Peter Elkind, who was also a Fortune writer. But Joe basically put that together and helped me and Peter find each other and edited that book. So the only theme for me in co-authoring has been working with Joe. I don't think I could co-author with anybody else, and nor do I think I would have done any of these books without Joe. So it's less been a process of, this is a great idea, should I work with somebody and who should it be, than it has been me and Joe as a team. And that's just because we work very well together. We have overlapping skill sets. I'd say he's a better writer than I am, and I still think that's true. A better storyteller. He knows how to pull back and simplify more than I do, although I've gotten better at it over time. But I still think he's better at it, and I'm more of an analyst and a reporter. And so that's the way in which we've worked together, is because we both have an appreciation of each other's skills. If he reads something I've written and says, "This sucks," and it doesn't work, I don't say, "Oh, what do you mean?" I say,
Yeah.
"Okay, all right, how do we fix this?" And I don't think that's a relationship for me that I could replicate with anybody else.
And the way you approach it, do you approach it where you take the different topics and you silo it off and say, look, Joe, you're going to do this, and Bethany's going to do this? Or do you say, you know what, we're going to handle them together, and then we're going to try and put them together to create a story? How do you typically go at it?
So it's been a little bit different. In the case of All the Devils Are Here, I did a lot more of the reporting and the initial writing, and Joe really did a lot more of the pulling it together into a coherent book. In this case, the big fail, we really did the latter. We took separate topics and we both really went after those topics. And then once again, it was Joe who helped it all come together as a coherent book. But I frankly think he did more of the work on this book than I did, because he did a lot of the original reporting and then he did a lot of the pulling it together as well.
Okay. So when we look at COVID, I'm going to ask you a question that, you can't answer in a short period of time, but I'm going to ask it anyway, Bethany, is that when you look in hindsight at the United States and you were to rank them on a scale of 1 to 10, when we look back at everything, everything you've uncovered, and you'd say, I need to give them a ranking on how they handled COVID-19, the U.S.
Yep.
government in its aggregate. Where would you scale them on a scale of 1 to 10, and why would you support that? Why would you support that rating?
So I think somewhere in the bottom part, although some part of it was not the fault of the government heading into the pandemic. I think one of the controversial things we said in the book is that a lot of how COVID-19 was going to go in this country was already baked in by the time COVID-19 hit. And that's really the failings of our healthcare system, which have been written about a lot in recent weeks due to the unfortunate events, the horror of the shooting of the United Healthcare CEO. But people are justifiably nothing justifies what happened there, but people are justifiably angry at the healthcare system. And the fact that we are so unhealthy is one of the reasons that COVID-19 hit this country so hard. And that's nothing that anybody could have done anything about in the moment. And also the great inequality of the way our system is set up is also something that made COVID-19 really hard to handle here, because we have great ways of getting money to big business by just unleashing the Fed. And the Fed then can by cutting rates, can enable big businesses to borrow at rock bottom rates. And we don't have any real ways of supporting small business. So we tried to address that through various government programs, the PPP plan, but that led to a lot of fraud. But that's because there wasn't a structure in place to enable small businesses to get through a period like this. We didn't have any way of doing that. But I think some of the dysfunction of our government was on display as well. Its inability to work together, and some of our political divides were on display too. The fact that it stunned me at the beginning stages of the pandemic, and it still stunned me today, that how you thought we should handle the pandemic became a matter of your political party. I mean, how utterly and completely absurd is that? I remember being on Twitter in the early stages of the pandemic and saying we needed to get kids back into school, and stating my position then, which was that lockdowns were not the way to go with this. And a couple of people, one friend actually suggested doing an intervention because she said she said I had clearly become a Trump voter, and I was like, wait, what? How does the fact that I think children should be back in school and that lockdowns aren't justified and aren't the right way to handle this, how does that say anything about my political affinity? The two things are completely different issues. But even still through to today, if you say that, you become identified as a Republican. And I just think that's the most absurd thing there could ever be. I mean, would how you think we should treat cancer or how you think we should treat mental illness be a sign of your political affiliation? Anyway, so I think that's a really complicated way of answering your question, but I think COVID, it's less that we met COVID fresh. It's that COVID became a mirror on a lens on all of our society's failings, all of our pre-existing failings. It's almost as if we had these pre-existing conditions in this country and COVID brought them out.
And one of the points of your book I found really interesting was when George Bush was, he had first identified the issue of, this pandemic happened back in 2000 in 1918, or at some point in the early 1900s. Maybe it could happen every 100 years, because someone had mentioned that this sort of stuff happens every 100 years, and he did some reading, and again, history tends to repeat itself. Why do you think more couldn't have been done in advance to really predict that this could have happened? Because you would have thought, you mentioned lockdowns and masks and stuff like that. Like, you just would have thought, we could argue about the effectiveness of all of this stuff, in terms of, and again, points of view on either side, that, you're going to have you can have a healthy debate, irrespective of your political background, a
Right.
healthy debate about which of these are most effective. But you certainly would have thought that the governments would have scientifically studied this stuff in advance and come up with a plan of action. You know what I
Well,
mean? And that's what that. And I'm just wondering, after all you learned, are you surprised that they didn't do more in advance on some of that stuff, or do you think that again, we go back to surprise, that nobody ever would have thought it would go to this extent?
so I think there were plans in place, and that was part of what the government tried to do after George Bush realized the potential for a pandemic, and there were plans in place, but plans are plans have limitations. Even if plans can be well executed, and even if things had been even if government had been more competent than it was, there's a limitation to what plans can accomplish. And let me just the clearest example to me of this is that in the end, COVID was not influenza. So if COVID were influenza, then you would want to shut down the schools. You would want to lock kids down, because kids would both be um, potential victims of this as well as transmitters of this. That's how influenza works. COVID was not that. Kids in schools weren't hotbeds of transmission, and kids were healthy children weren't going to, or almost certainly not going to get that sick from COVID. And so there's a limitation on what plans can accomplish, because if you're too wedded to what your plans are, then you can't see that the thing that has happened might not line up with what those plans were, and might call for flexibility in the face of it. So there's plans themselves have a tension in them, right? They can provide a roadmap, but if you adhere too closely to what the plan is, you can actually miss the bigger picture about how this is different, about how it's different this time. Because, as you've said, history does repeat itself, but what's the old saying? History rhymes, and it doesn't repeat. And so, assuming that what's happening now is what happened before can be as dangerous as not remembering what happened before.
So you take something like lockdowns, for example, and even if you look at a lot of different countries, had a lot of different rules and requirements with their own lockdowns. Even if you look at the United States, many of the different states, you talk a lot about Florida
Yeah.
and DeSantis and how he went after how he dealt with the issue. Like, do you think something as simple as lockdowns, do you think that was studied in advance to really conclude? Like, just would have thought that something like that they would look at and they would say it's either effective or it's not effective.
Well, it
So do
was
you think it was looked at in advance? And even now, if the same thing were to happen again, what do you think the government would like? Do you think they have a scientific answer on are lockdowns effective?
No, there's no scientific answer, and it actually had been studied in advance, and the conclusion was they don't work.
Oh,
That the
really?
most effective way to handle a pandemic is to allow people to go about their normal lives as much as you possibly can, and that it's not effective to lock down a society. And by the way, the people who say we never locked down in the U.S., there's some validity to that, because it was only the wealthy and privileged who were able to stay safe at home, and the only reason that was a pleasant experience for many people was because other people were out there delivering their Amazon packages
Yep.
and their food, and bearing the brunt of being out there in the world. And so we lockdowns themselves were an exercise in inequality, right? And then the children of the wealthy, their private schools often stayed open. Kids were able to continue to get an education. It's the children of the less well off who couldn't go to school and who lost years of education. So we didn't even the United States was not capable of locking down in a way that was fair. And so that's a whole part of this too. So there are a couple of different parts of the lockdown debate. One is, do they work over the long term? The answer would have been no, they don't. And the second is, could we in this country lock down in a way that was fair and protected everybody? And the answer is no, we couldn't. So I think but we lurched into copying China, basically. The whole
Yeah.
Western world did, instead of saying, well, wait, does what seems to be working in an authoritarian society actually work in a democracy? And nobody asked that question. We all just lurched and copied China. And that to me is very dispiriting. And the fact that then discussion around that was shut down, and the people who said, wait, maybe this isn't the way to handle this, were demonized. really says scary things about the way our world operates today.
Yeah, like it should be getting into healthy debates on this stuff.
Yeah.
People should be free to express even if you don't agree,
Yeah.
you at least understand their point of view. The other one I want to ask you about, Bethany, is mask wearing. This is another one where if you were to bring up pictures from the early 1900s when they had the first pandemic, you would see people wearing masks.
Yeah.
They were like, it wasn't, so we're talking about something like 100 years ago where people were wearing masks. And now we've got a similar situation that's arisen, 100 years later or whatever it may be. And yet there's this big debate on whether masks are effective. And again, you can build up arguments from both sides of the fence here.
Well,
And I'm just wondering, when you look at it now, do you think this was studied in advance? And do you think if the pandemic were to happen again, would there be a mask mandate? Like, do they know the answer? Are masks effective or not?
they don't know the answer. The biggest study of this that came out was done by the Cochrane Institute, and they basically concluded we don't know if masks work. They didn't say masks don't work. They said we don't know if masks work on if a society-wide mask mandate works, and we don't know. And the problem is there are different levels in the quality of masks, and then there were crazy, insane requirements that made people not trust the health officials who mandated mask wearing. So the idea that Dr. Fauci said at the beginning, masks don't work, we don't need them, and then he reversed his stance and said they do work. I think it's pretty clear at the end of it that a cloth mask worn badly doesn't do that much. A cloth mask worn badly in a restaurant where you have to put your mask on if you walk to the bathroom, and while you're sitting down and eating, you can take your mask off. Is there any sense whatsoever behind that rule? Absolutely none. And so there were all these things about the way mask wearing was implemented that mean it was bound to look like a failure. And did it work? Should we wear masks the next time around? We have no idea.
That's crazy. That's just insane when you talk about it like that. To think of everything everything we've been through, and we still don't know the answer
No.
on a question that's, look, I understand there's lots of different masks. There's lots of people, people can wear them, people put them down, but you would have thought we'd have a bit of a clearer answer on that. The other one I wanted to talk to you about, which it sounds like maybe there's a little bit more of a consensus behind, is social distancing. Is that perhaps on that one, there's a little bit more scientific evidence that one actually makes sense to some degree, and that maybe that gets put in place in the event that there's another pandemic. But maybe I'm offside. What do you think on social distancing, Bethany? Do you think there's something behind that, or is that something as well that,
Well,
again, we just can't put in place? It just doesn't, like en masse, it just doesn't work.
right. Well, we just don't know. I mean, in the end, for sure, social distancing would work if you have a contagious disease and everybody is confined to their own little box and only allowed to breathe the air in their own little box, and somehow you're able to run the world like that. Then, yeah, the contagious disease isn't going to spread. But there's a rubber meets the road aspect to this. Like, how doable is that? Well, that's not doable. So
Yeah.
then what kind of social distancing are you talking about? Dr. Fauci has admitted, as have other people, there was never anything scientific about the 6-foot rule between people. Does 6 feet matter? Does 12 feet matter?
Yeah.
I mean, some amount of distance, yeah, again, if you put everybody in their own little coffin and nobody's allowed to share any air, then disease isn't going to spread. But can we do that? And then what's doable? And does what's doable make enough of a difference for it to be worth its cost? That's the key question. And it comes back to everything we've talked about here. It's messy. And you have to be willing to ask, is it worth the cost? And that's something we weren't willing to ask in the pandemic. You were a good person if you believed in any sort of measure to blunt the spread of COVID, regardless of the cost. If you said, wait, there's a cost to this, and is it worth the cost? You were a bad person, at least in the sort of way our society judged during this. And that all is just completely absurd. And so what I would hope is less that we have an answer and more that we are adult enough and capable of enough nuance and capable of handling complexity, so that if something like this does happen again, we can say not only what does this intervention look like, but does this intervention do the possible benefits of this intervention justify the cost? I think we would all look back now and say that keeping kids out of school for years was not worth the cost.
Yeah, well, the irony with that question is that we might not really know the answer to that question for another 20 years when our kids are, at a different, kind of fully developed and at a
Yeah.
different point in their life. Yeah, because when you have somebody, you mentioned too about these two, the multiple classes of society. We were lucky to have, a good internet and a computer and stuff like that. And again, you talk about these, even the ability to work from home. We're very fortunate to have that. These heartbreaking stories where these kids are left alone. Well, it's terrible, right? Like
Yeah.
and I guess where that is going to get me is, do you think that we're any better prepared now for the next pandemic than what we were in, let's call it 2019?
No, I think we are far worse prepared, and that's because there is this broad view that societies that handle a pandemic best, that are the best equipped to deal with the unexpected, are those where there's a great deal of trust. And the way in which we handled the pandemic decimated trust. It didn't build trust, it decimated trust. And I think part of that were the pre-existing conditions we had going into this, a healthcare system that doesn't believe in healthcare for everybody. When you saw those terrible, terrible images of overrun hospitals in the early stages of the pandemic, they were almost all hospitals in poor neighborhoods. They weren't hospitals in wealthy places, and that's the issue right there in a nutshell. The pandemic, the way in which we handled it economically, benefited the wealthy. It made the well-off even more well-off, while shutting down thousands of small businesses across the country. But then the way in which the health establishment handled this, by shutting down dissenting voices, censoring them, um, trying to mandate rules that in retrospect seem either clearly nonsensical or just inexplicable, means that next time around, whatever the healthcare establishment tells us, people are going to say, I don't know if I believe that. And the next time around, the healthcare establishment might be absolutely right. They might be telling us to do something we all need to do, but people aren't going to trust it.
Yeah, and that is another thing that really comes out of the book is the impact on trust in your government, and how the impact on society as a result of that, and how willing you are to follow the rules. The other thing that I found interesting was when you talk about computer modeling, because you talk in one way and say, well, this stuff could have been predicted. They could have looked at this in advance. They could have run computer models, and really figured out how this was going to spread. They could have, run these in advance, but maybe just talk a little bit about the issues of computer modeling and trying to actually predict, because again, the importance of kind of thinking on your feet and being able to make decisions in a real-time basis. Like, you can't predict everything that's going to happen in advance. There has to be some flexibility to do that. And maybe just talk a little bit about the computer modeling, because I found that really interesting as well, but in your book.
Yeah, so it is a theme that's run through a bunch of my work, including All the Devils Are Here, because one of the things that led to the financial crisis was this belief in the output of models. And so all the big financial firms had these models called value at risk that purported to say how much money they could lose in a given trading day. And all the value at risk models showed that the losses from subprime mortgages would be very small, would be very contained. And so CEOs relied on these models, and they forgot the old rule of modeling, which is garbage in, garbage out. So the same thing was true in the pandemic. Any model purporting to show anything is based on the quality of the inputs. And people forget that. People want to believe, especially during fraught times, that the answer that's spitting out of a model, because it looks scientific, must be right. And they forget that a model is, in the end, it's a way of asking questions at its best. It's a way of formulating what you think the issues are and setting up what that might look like if these are the issues and these inputs play out as you expect. But it's not truth with a capital T. And so then you have to take your model and you have to always stress test it against reality. So is this what's actually happening? And so I remember that was one of the things that actually in the early stage of the pandemic made me think, what is going on here? Because there are these models, I'm forgetting the name of the institute that everybody was quoting, about how hospital beds were going to be overrun across the country, and how ventilator supplies were going to be short, and how this was what was happening here. And if you looked on the ground at various places, that wasn't what was happening at all.
Yeah.
The model was telling you something that was already not lining up with reality. And I thought, how is this model being cited so broadly and widely when all you have to do is go test it against, and it doesn't mean that the model wasn't raising a valid point or a valid issue, but if it's already not lining up with reality, then you have to start to question the inputs into the model. And so I think a lot of what happened in the pandemic, and still happens, where people say, well, this model shows what would have happened if we had worn masks or we hadn't worn masks. We have to step back and look, well, what are the inputs? What are the assumptions going into that model?
Yeah.
But
Well,
that
look,
but that's too much work for most of us. We like the number that spits out at the bottom of the model instead, right?
what you mentioned hospital beds, again, what was really interesting in your book is learning about some of the motivations is that, you had these for-profit institutions. And just because a computer model says they have X number of beds available or X number of ventilators available or whatever it may be, doesn't actually mean that those beds are actually available.
Yeah.
And it was very, getting into the details of the U.S. healthcare system was certainly eye-opening. Now, if we're going to hopefully talk about a positive, hopefully this is one positive that we can kind of end up on is the vaccine. That was one thing that was put together relatively quickly. Operation Warp Speed. And again, it was very interesting in your book, learning about the cooperation, let's call it, of the government entities with the non-government entities and kind of what the best practices of each of those kind of brought to the table. But maybe just talk. Do you think that was one of the better things that was done during the pandemic? And maybe just talk about why was the vaccine more successful, let's say, than some of the other? Because you would have thought what would be the hardest thing to come up with is a vaccine. Like, I just can't
Right.
imagine the brain power that went into actually figuring this out.
Yeah.
I could imagine it would be through the stratosphere. One of the most challenging things. You would have thought that's a lot more scientifically hard to figure out than whether masks are effective. So, where do you stand? How do we get the vaccine right or much better than, let's say, the rest of some of the other elements of COVID?
Yeah, so I still think that Operation Warp Speed is one of the great bright lights of the pandemic, despite what happened afterwards. And I do want to come back to what happened afterwards. But I still think it was people within the Trump administration, namely Alex Azar, who was the head of Health and Human Services, who understood the limitations of the free market to fix this. Because if you were a rabid free market person, you would have said, oh, there's a pandemic. Whichever company can come up with a vaccine is going to make a fortune. So let's just turn the market loose. And therefore, then we'll have a vaccine. And that's not the way the modern world works. It's maybe not the way any world works. But for years, vaccine makers have been penalized because they scrambled to come up with vaccines and only to have it turn out that they weren't needed. And so the market has often penalized companies for rushing to make a vaccine because governments are the buyers. In large part, vaccine makers. The vaccine business isn't well regarded on Wall Street. So companies were not going to race to make a vaccine unless the government stepped in and created certain preconditions. And so what Operation Warp Speed did was figure out what the preconditions were that private industry needed in order to successfully race to make a vaccine. And that included both a guaranteed market so that they wouldn't invest all this money only to turn out that there wasn't a market for their product, and the support to manufacture in the U.S. because that no longer existed. And so Operation Warp Speed was both the creation of a market, but it was also a giant industrial mobilization story in the sense of being able to manufacture the vaccine in the U.S. took all sorts of mammoth interventions by the government. So I really do view that as the best example of what capitalism should be, which is the government working hand in hand with private industry to set the rules that enable private industry to be successful and to do the right thing. And I would hope that that's a lesson that we can all learn from, because one of the things that working on this book made me think about is that the free market, even the freest of free markets, only exists with government rules, right? And I mean, even your most rabid free market believers wouldn't be able to function if there weren't bankruptcy court, if there weren't limited liability corporations. So
Yep.
the rules need to be set in a way that brings out the best in the market. And so I really do view the vaccine story as being that writ large. I think what happened afterwards with vaccine mandates and the booster strategy in the U.S. was another terrible misstep by public health and has led to loss of faith in vaccines that might be very, very dangerous for us, particularly now in this time. But I think looking at this as simplistically as we have a set of people coming in who are raising questions about vaccines excuses the people who created some of the vaccine hesitancy by their overreach.
The other thing that I found really interesting too is which I failed to appreciate before I read your book was the importance of logistics and how the U.S. military is so good at logistics and just getting the vaccines in the right hands and all the moving pieces. That was, even you talk in the book about how they acknowledge when instructions are given, the other person on the other end says acknowledged.
Yeah.
Like again, that doesn't really happen in the business world. Per se, where again, but it happens in the military world, which makes complete sense because there's a lot of cases in the business world where instructions are misunderstood, and people don't necessarily understand them the way that they were communicated.
Yeah.
Maybe just talk a little bit about the importance of logistics, because this was a massive undertaking to get all of these vaccines, all the way through the process, eventually into the arms of the beneficiaries.
Yeah, it's one of the models for Operation Warp Speed was the Manhattan Project, and so part of what they modeled themselves after was having both a scientific lead, an Oppenheimer, and a logistics lead in the form of Leslie Grove of the Manhattan Project. And so in this case, it was Moncef Slaoui who was the scientific lead, and then General Gustav Perna of the Army, who was the logistics lead. And I think that the story of how the Army logistics people worked with the people from private industry is great, and one of the really shining moments of an otherwise pretty bleak period. And if you think about it, does make you think more broadly about the importance of logistics to life. I mean, anytime you go to war, not that I'm advocating for that, but you think about the logistics that are required to make a war successful. And part of the whole story of World War I and World War II is logistics and lack thereof, ability to feed your army to right.
Absolutely.
And so it's really fascinating when you start to think about that and how utterly capable the army is of that. And yes, I absolutely loved learning more about how these conference calls, and I think private business could learn a lot from how the Army handles things, whether it was the way in which they ended you stopped talking when you had different cues for when you were taking a breath, when you were talking on a conference call, and when you were actually done, and somebody else could then step in, and very clear system of accountability, who was
Yeah.
responsible for getting something done and when that was going to be reported back, because you can't allow that kind of slippage in the Army. And I thought every business person should actually read that and implement some of that if you want to run as tight a ship as Army logistics can be. So
I
yeah,
agree with you. I totally, and that was, I agree with every word you just said. I totally agree. So you and Joe write the book. It's been out now for a bit, and I'm interested to know, does anyone from the government give you a call, Bethany, and say, look, great book, read your book, please come into our, wherever, and let's just talk about, how we incorporate maybe some of the learnings from your book. Is there any of that goes on?
no, absolutely none. The book really just flopped, and I think that is partly and Joe. Of course, it's upsetting if you work this hard on something and nobody reads it and it doesn't do well. And I think part of it is that people weren't ready to read about the pandemic. But I think another piece of it is that the book isn't ideological in a time when we are all so polarized and so ideological. The book doesn't line up neatly with anybody's pre-existing sense of how one should think about things. And so I think that it didn't find a natural audience because there were things in it that anybody could hate, basically. And part of it is that there is this widespread censorship there was, of competing views about the pandemic. And so nobody reviewed our book. And that sounds like an arrogant, whiny thing to say, except that Joe and I have never written a book that hasn't been reviewed anywhere. And people just didn't want anything to do with it because it didn't line up with the conventional mainstream media view of how we should have handled the pandemic. But I do think that the book, Joe and I were texting the other day, and I said I think was more right and more prescient than basically anything we've written, whether it's about the healthcare system, about the role of private equity in healthcare, about our handling of the pandemic. about the role of the Federal Reserve in our economy. I think there's a lot that we wrote about that is really relevant today. How's that for a marketing pitch?
Well, I
But
look,
it's but look, it's over, unfortunately.
I
But
love the book.
thank you,
I
thank
just
you.
thought that there's so many. Now it's a good time to reflect upon on what happens. I think history repeats itself. It's going to happen. It's going to happen again. Um, and you go in and even just to understand the why behind some of the stuff, right? Like, why was this done? And some of the issues, again, as you mentioned, at different classes of society, right? Where,
Yeah,
the stories about people going to work in Amazon factories and things like that. I don't mean to pick on Amazon at all, because again, I think it was new for everybody, but anybody who had to go to work in person and the issues and the fear that was felt because of the unknown, like it does bring you back to a time that, we'd all like to forget, but it's important, especially for the governments, that they debrief and they learn from that.
yeah,
And to make sure
yeah,
that when the next one happens, that there's an action plan in place that says, look, like, this is what we're going to do and this is why, and we're not going to change our mind every 3 months. You know what I mean? And,
yeah.
and even just outline too the background behind it. Someone says wear a mask, and then just outline the research, and like you said, it goes back to building up that trust. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that one thing you're getting at that is really important is the role of humility in a modern society, because the old top down method of managing people by telling them what you want them to believe, even if it might not be true, and even if you know it's not true, doesn't work anymore, because we all have Google and ChatGPT at our fingertips, and everybody can figure out if you're telling them the truth or not, and if you're telling them what you know or not. You have to be willing to say. And I still do have enough trust and faith in most of our citizenry that if you had said to people, look, we don't know if wearing a mask makes a difference or not, but it's a pretty small ask in the end of the day. So why don't we do this? But we don't know if and it's not
100%.
it's not a mark of your virtue of a person, as a human being, that
100%.
you're masked or double masked. Let's just do this for each other because we don't know, and then let's look at it and see what works. I think you'd have
100%.
an entirely different, just that alone. I think you would have come out of this with a different approach. If people had said after the vaccine was released, look, we don't know if this vaccine prevents transmission. That was not an endpoint of the testing. We think it might. So let's all get vaccinated. Let's please all get vaccinated. Let's see what happens. But we don't know if this prevents transmission. We don't know if this is going to stop you from getting COVID. Those weren't the endpoints of the clinical trial. I think people would feel differently about it than being mandated to get a vaccine because they were told it was going to prevent transmission, only to find out that no, it didn't. And I think that those again, humility. Admit what you
100%.
don't know. It's the only way to go forward in the modern world.
100% agree with you. It's a perfect way to end this. I totally agree with you. Last question for you, Bethany. Next project on the go. Is there anything you can talk about? Are you and Joe teaming up to another one? Anything in the hopper coming from Bethany McLean that we can look forward to in the next year or so?
I mean, the last book, this book, The Big Fail, basically about killed both of us. So I don't know if Joe and I can survive another. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But I'm working on a couple of pieces for Business Insider, and I do this podcast with Luigi Zancalos at the University of Chicago called Capitalisn't, and it's an attempt to look at what is and what isn't working in capitalism, which has become a subject near and dear to my heart because I still think Winston Churchill's old saying about democracy, the worst possible system with the exception of everything else we've ever tried, is true of capitalism too. And I wish we could all be invested in saving it, and particularly people in power would stop abusing it for their own ends and destroying all of our faith in it, and instead figure out how to make it work for everybody. Because if we don't do that, it is going to get torn down and destroyed.
No, well said. I
So
agree with you. Well, thank you very much for taking the time, and yeah, we really appreciate having a conversation today about all three of your books. Which, again, if it was up to me, I would highly recommend each one of them. But Bethany, thank you very much for taking the time today.
thank you so much for having me and for the really thorough interview and for all of your interest. It's really great. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, that wraps another episode of CSI Chat, and I really wanted to thank everybody for listening. If you want to keep up to date on CSI Chat, I would encourage everyone to join our CSI Chat LinkedIn group and or follow us on Twitter/X under CSI Chat. With that, I will get you out of here on a high note with some music, and thanks again.
Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our host an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. CSI Chat, where the numbers meet the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. Tune in every week for a mix of win facts with a clever accountant who's got your back. We'll laugh and we'll learn and solve the mystery on CSI Chat, where the topic set us free. Tune in every week for a mix of win facts with a clever accountant who's got your back. We'll laugh and we'll learn and solve the mystery on CSI Chat, where the topic set us free. CSI Chat is the podcast you'll adore. With our accountant host, you'll always want more. So grab your headphones and join the fun on CSI Chat, where the mysteries never